Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the July 2024 edition of Socialism for All, and today we're going to read The Struggle Against Revisionism by William Z. Foster from 1945. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting the channel on Patreon or buy me a coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So this piece is the next installment in our anti-Browderism playlist, also known as the First Wave USA Anti-Revisionism playlist. And it is a report to the Special Convention of the Communist Political Association, which was the group which temporarily replaced the CPUSA, held in New York City, July 26 to 28, 1945, which reconstituted the Communist Party of the USA, or CPUSA. So in other words, the leadership under General Secretary Earl Browder, who at one time in the 20s and 30s was a very good communist, writing prolifically on the labor movement and politics, in the 1940s got so bad, so revisionist, that it actually became openly liquidationist, and they liquidated CPUSA, actually replacing it with this CPA, Communist Political Association. So as we've covered in previous installments of this playlist, which if you haven't heard them, definitely do go back and listen to those. There's a link in the description to that playlist. Foster also leaned to the right, but he still wasn't nearly as bad as Browder. So that's part of the criticism we're going to get into after we finished with this section of the playlist, which is drawn from a collection known as Marxism-Leninism versus Revisionism, which basically represents the face of official anti-Browderism. But after we're done with that, which is phase 2, phase 1 having been texts from Browder himself, in phase 3 we're going to talk about the critics of official anti-Browderism. In other words, these people who reconstituted the CPUSA, basically under Foster's leadership, largely were the same people who just a few years prior had been singing the praises of Browderism. So, how much can you trust them? And so there were criticisms that this didn't really go far enough, and that some of the underlying problems which led to the rise of Browderism didn't really get pulled out at the root. Nevertheless, over the party being liquidated, this seemed like a positive step forward, and actually the day after this conference was ended, Mao Zedong issued a telegram to Foster, wishing them well with the reconstitution of the party, which was basically the focus of this convention. So with that said, let's begin. During the past several weeks, we've been engaged in the frankest, deepest, and most self-critical theoretical analysis and practical political discussion in the history of our party. Now, therefore, in its overwhelming majority, our party has become convinced that our policy for the past 18 months was a, quote, notorious revision of Marxism. The complete dissolution of the party in the South shows where Comrade Browder was leading with his policy. Section 1. Our party's revisionist mistake, its origin and course. Browder, with his revisionism, was trying to fasten a system of right-wing bourgeois liberalism upon our party, a liberalism so conservative that on many questions it put us far to the right of Roosevelt, of the liberal press, and of the main sections of the labor movement. This revisionism has nothing in common with Marxism-Leninism, being a complete abandonment of its basic principles. Point A. Browder's line is a rejection of the Marxian economic doctrines. Browder has developed bourgeois theories of the liquidation of the capitalist cyclical and general crises. He rejects Marx's theory of surplus value and of the exploitation of the workers. Thus, for the past 2 years, our party has made no criticism whatsoever of capitalism as a system of human exploitation, nor has it challenged the blood-wrung profits of the employers. Instead, we have heard many comrades, without rebuke from Browder, talking about our alleged obligation to guarantee the employers, already the richest in the world, a so-called fair profit. Wow, that such shameful nonsense should be heard in a communist organization. Yeah, and commenting, that is basically what fascism is about, is trying to guarantee profits to the capitalists. Amazing. Continuing, when Browder adopted so glibly the slogan of free enterprise, he accepted in practice most of bourgeois economics along with it. With his great faith in capitalism, he outdoes even such enthusiastic bourgeois economists as Chase, Hansen, and Johnston. Point B. Browder's line is a rejection of the Marxian principles of the class struggle. Comrade Browder denies the class struggle by sowing illusions among the workers of a long post-war period of harmonious class relations with generous-minded employers, by asserting that class relations no longer have any meaning, except as they are expressed either for or against Tehran, Comment, this is discussed in previous videos, but Tehran refers to the Tehran Declarations or Tehran Agreements between the US, UK, and USSR during World War II. Continuing, by substituting for Marxian class principles such idealistic abstractions as the, quote, moral sense, enlightenment, progressivism, and true class interests of the big monopolists as determining factors in establishing their class relations with the workers. Browder's theories of class collaboration and the harmony of interest between capital and labor are cut from the same opportunistic cloth as those of Bernstein, Le Guin, and Gompers, except that his ideas are more shamelessly bourgeois than anything ever produced by these notorious revisionists of the past. Point C. Browder's line is a rejection of the Marxian concept of the progressive and revolutionary initiative of the working class, and with it, the vanguard role of the Communist Party. The very foundation of Marxism-Leninism is that the working class, with the Communist Party at its head, leads the democratic masses of the people in the amelioration of their conditions under capitalism. Comment, that would be temporary reforms for the improvement of conditions under capitalism, continuing, and also in the eventual establishment of socialism. But Comrade Browder has thrown this whole conception overboard. His books, Victory and After, and especially Tehran, Our Path in War and Peace, present the thesis of a progressive capitalist class, particularly American finance capital, leading the peoples of this country and the world to the achievement of the great objectives of the Moscow, Tehran, Yalta, and San Francisco conferences and the building of a peaceful, democratic, and prosperous society. Browder sees labor and the democratic forces, including the Communist Party, playing only a secondary, non-decisive role in the present-day world. And a quick comment, Marxists do recognize that capitalists at one time represented a progressive force in history, back when feudalism was the dominant mode of production. The capitalists led revolutions against feudalism, and thereby continued historical progress. However, since capitalism became imperialism in the 20th century, or in other words, advanced monopoly capitalism as described in Lenin's book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, from that point on, it has nothing else to offer in terms of historical progress, and historical progress can only continue through proletarian revolution and the building of socialism. Continuing, point D. Browder's line is a rejection of the Leninist theory of imperialism as the final stage of capitalism. Comrade Browder, in his books and speeches, paints a utopian picture of a world capitalist system, not moribund, but vigorous and progressive, especially in its American section, a world capitalist system about to enter into a period of unprecedented expansion. It is a denial of the general crisis of the capitalist system. Browder believes that under the leadership of his, quote, enlightened American monopolists, the imperialist ruling classes in this and other capitalist countries will peacefully and spontaneously compose their differences with each other, with the USSR, with the liberated countries of Europe, and with the colonial and semi-colonial countries without mass struggle. This is the bourgeois liberal notion that the epoch of imperialism is past. It conflicts fundamentally with the Leninist theory of imperialism as the last stage of a decadent capitalist system. Comment, it also has some things in common with Karl Kautsky's ultra-imperialism, which was the theoretical basis Kautsky used to justify the selling out of the socialist parties involved in the Second International, opportunistically endorsing World War I. We have an audiobook of that on the channel, combined with Lenin's comments, which completely rejected it. Continuing, point E. Browder's line is a rejection of the Marxian-Leninist perspective of socialism. Obviously, if world capitalism, under the leadership of Comrade Browder's beneficent American monopolists, can overcome its inner contradictions and produce an era of well-being and capitalist progress, such as Browder sees ahead, the whole question of socialism is reduced to a mere abstraction. Browder accepts this logic and has abandoned the advocacy of socialism, even in a purely educational sense. In his book on Tehran, he casts aside our party's ultimate goal of socialism and expands our program of immediate demands into a fantastic capitalist utopia which leaves no room whatever for socialism. From all of this, it should be clear that Browder is preaching anti-Marxism, in fact a, quote, notorious revision of Marxism, as Duclos said. He is fighting our party, and with it, what he has designated as, quote, the Marxists of Europe. But like all other revisionists, he presents his opportunism under the false flag of a Marxism brought up to date. That he realizes he is making a head-on attack upon the whole body of Marxist-Leninist principles, however, is clear from his often expressed scorn for the, quote, old books and old formulas, by which, of course, he means Marxist-Leninist books and formulas. Browder would have us throw away the Marxist-Leninist classics and adopt instead his right-wing bourgeois liberalism, which he misnames Marxism. His two latest books cannot be called Marxist works. They are more akin to the ideas of Eric Johnston than to those of Karl Marx. Browder's amazing bourgeois revisionism is a surrender to the pressure of American imperialism upon our party. Comment: when we talk about ostensibly left media and analysts caving to the right wing and starting to play to the right wing or grifting to the right, this is exactly what we're talking about. What you're supposed to do is to fight against those tendencies because this is class struggle in the ideological realm. You're not supposed to capitulate to it, and you're definitely not supposed to just take right-wing ideas and start labeling them Marxism and say, hey, we spread Marxism to right-wing people. No, that isn't what you did. You're not making right-wing ideas better, you're making Marxism worse. Continuing, the class beneficiaries of his whole program are the big capitalists of this country. His line dovetails with their plans of imperialist expansion and world domination when he sows illusions about their alleged progressivism, hides their imperialist aggressions, spins capitalist utopias that shut out all perspectives of socialism, deludes the workers with prospects of their employers voluntarily doubling their wages in the post-war stage, and weakens the Communist Party by transforming it into the Communist Political Association, etc. Thus he plays into the hands of the most reactionary elements, American big capitalists, who in the post-war period will be the strongest world force making for economic chaos, fascist reaction, and a new world war. One of the most dangerous aspects of Browder's revisionism is that it was penetrating into the communist parties of other lands through the spread of his writings. Thus, a number of our brother parties in this hemisphere, especially in Latin America, became infected with it, thereby weakening their guard against advancing American imperialism. Various European and Asiatic parties also felt the liquidatory effects of Browderism. Indeed, Browder wrote a public letter to the Communist Party of Australia, virtually telling it what it should and should not do, advice which that party indignantly rejected. Before the Duclos article was published, Browder also contemplated sending a public letter to the British Communist Party, urging it to orientate itself in the then approaching parliamentary elections on the perspective of an election alliance between the British Democratic forces and the Churchill group of Tories against the reactionaries. How preposterous this sounds now in view of the Labour Party's victory over Churchill. Browder's plan apparently was to develop some sort of a loosely integrated cooperation between such communist parties as he could influence, with the CPA as a New World center, with himself as its leader, and with his revisionist policies as its program. The Duclos article smashed this whole plan. And commenting, the Duclos article is included in this playlist if you go back a few videos. Continuing, Browder's revisionism, although it burst into full expression following the Tehran Conference, has roots reaching back several years earlier in his party leadership. An examination of this earlier period will reveal the major reasons why the communist movement has not made greater progress in the United States during the past several years. Browder's policies have been a detriment to our party for years. Our party discussion has made it clear that Comrade Browder's revisionism has exerted a weakening effect upon our wartime policy. Many of our comrades still believe that Browder's policy was necessary during the war. It was not. It was definitely a detriment in our war work, as I have shown in detail in my article in The Worker of June 10. And not a few believe that Browder worked out our policy of all-out support of the war, of strengthening the United Nations coalition, of the fight for the Second Front, of maximum war production, of the no-strike pledge, etc. But this is not true. Browder was in Atlanta, he was in prison, when this correct general war policy was developed, and he had nothing whatever to do with its formulation. Almost as soon as he was released from prison, however, he began to undermine our correct policy with his enervating revisionism. He did not succeed, however, in completely destroying our otherwise correct wartime policy. Despite his revisionism, our party may well be proud of its record during the war, its wholehearted and devoted struggle on every front to win the war. The full destructive force of Browder's revisionism would have been felt, however, if we had attempted to extend his policies over into the post-war period. This would have proved disastrous to our mass work and to our party itself. The corrective Duclos article arrived at a most opportune time for us. So comment here, the basic Leninist policy regarding inter-imperialist war, developed during World War I, is revolutionary defeatism. That is, to turn the imperialist war into a war for socialist revolution. And in other words, in terms of the bourgeois imperialist objectives, to have all of those bourgeois governments lose. Now, at this time, there was the Popular Front policy, which did see communist parties joining with the bourgeois parties, and we'll discuss this more in a separate video, but I just wanted to make a note about that. Continuing, as it was, the corrosive effects of Browder's revisionism were fast bringing our party into a major internal crisis. His pro-capitalist liberalism alienated our party sympathizers and confused our party members. So badly had he undermined our policy that it finally took an expert to explain to a member of a progressive trade union why he should join the CPA or remain a member of it. Our members' morale fell rapidly. Fluctuation figures rose steeply, and our power to recruit members declined accordingly. The percentage of trade unionists dropped off sharply in our party. Our contacts with the Negro people were weakened, especially by the disastrous liquidation of our party in the South. Attendance at branch meetings declined alarmingly, and dues payment percentages fell to record low levels. This is what happens to a communist party when it gets poisoned with revisionism. It will take hard work upon our part to overcome this developing crisis and to start our party off again on a course of healthy growth and development. Comment, and indeed it would, but would they succeed and would it last? Continuing. A peculiarly harmful effect of our party's disease of Browder's revisionism was that by crippling the party's militancy, it tended to throw the workers into the grip of the pseudo-left demagogy of the Trotskyites, Rutherites, Thomasites, Dubinskyites, and Lewisites. The party membership is mystified as to how our party leadership, almost unanimously, came to make the serious mistake of adopting Browder's crudely revisionist line, especially during the past 18 months. Yes, definitely. Let me try to explain this. Please do. First, for several years prior to the adoption of Browder's distorted policy on Tehran, our party had, under Browder's leadership, slipped into the opportunist practice of supporting Roosevelt without serious self-criticism. It thereby began to adopt a wrong attitude toward the bourgeoisie. Our developing opportunistic attitude toward the capitalists was further strengthened by the failure to recognize clearly that the big capitalists of this country were supporting the war for their own imperialistic purposes, and not to advance the democratic objectives of the American people. Really, the big capitalists didn't want socialism? Amazing. Yeah, I can see how you would, somehow forget that. Browder's opportunistic line was to welcome the big capitalists more or less as loyal comrades in arms with the democratic forces. With all this opportunistic confusion as a background in party policy, it was not difficult for Browder, after the Tehran Conference, to take his final plunge into revisionism by contending that our so-called wartime cooperation with the big capitalists would be continued and intensified in the post-war period. This argumentation seemed reasonable to many, who I guess had not studied very much, for if the socialist sector of the world could arrive at an agreement on Tehran to cooperate in war and peace with the capitalist parts of the world, then why could not American workers and capitalists also work together in harmony in the war and in the post-war period? But see, that's where you have to stop yourself immediately. And immediately you would say, no, that's clearly going too far. So even that policy is limited. The cooperation between the USSR and the UK and US was limited, obviously, in the first place. And you wouldn't just extend that out. It's like saying, you get thirsty sometimes, so drinking water is good for you. Therefore, drinking 5,000 gallons of water in one sitting is also good for you. No, there's just literally no reason to take it that far at all. And any reasonable person would stop themselves. So I don't really actually consider this very reasonable at all. And somebody should have blown the whistle immediately. So that's already taking it too far, but continuing. With this opportunistic reasoning as a basis, Browder then added his utopian theories of a progressive capitalist system, the liquidation of imperialism, the harmony of interests between capital and labor, etc. Unfortunately, the rest of our party leadership was not able to demolish this complex utopian structure by exposing its grossly opportunistic core. But commenting again, let me stop you there, because you just said that this was alienating even sympathizers and junior, just joined members. If the sympathizers even were able to see through this and question it, why were you unable to do that? And I think that this was really more of a choice than they're letting on. There were already some attempts in some of the earlier pieces to explain this, is that Browder, there really wasn't democracy within the party. Browder was just sort of dictating policy, and so no one really was standing up to anything. And I don't know, that may have been more the issue, but continuing. Secondly, a vital reason why Comrade Browder was able to foist his opportunism upon our party was because of the super-centralism prevailing in our organization, and that's what I was just referring to. With his great personal prestige and his excessive degree of authority, Browder's word had become practically the law in our party. And again, why did you do that? But consequently, he was able to suppress any analytical discussion whatever of his false thesis regarding Tehran. It is my opinion that if Browder's proposals could have been really discussed, they would have been finally rejected by our party, but such a discussion was out of the question. So commenting, here we have another basic reason, and I think that this one carries a lot of weight, as to why the party headed down this road of just total self-destruction. Because there was no democracy within the party. So how did that happen? And I guess that is, they cite Browder's prestige and experience or whatever, but that's still violating the principles and the procedures of the party. So why did so many members allow that to happen at the upper levels? So there's a major failure there of not just one person, but of an organization. And then once you've put the whole organization in one person's hands, well, you can see the results here if they happen to go down the wrong course. Or again, was this intended, to go down this course, and then Browder made it happen in part by removing any of these checks? A democratic leader wants checks. They want some discussion. They want the, democratic centralism. It's the basic thing that Marxist-Leninist parties use. You need that. It's important. You need free and open discussion prior to the decision. And then the centralism is once the decision has been reached, everyone follows it. So without the democracy, you just have centralism, which is what happened in this case, just somebody making dictates and everyone else just follows them. But without the centralism, there's no real discipline to carry through the decisions once they're made. So all you have is the democracy, people just sort of endlessly discussing things, and nothing's ever sort of resolved or binding and carried through. So I'm really curious as to how that process happened, because, Browder's crazy ideas, it's one thing to pick apart how they are liberal, etc., but how structurally in the decision-making process of the organization did those come to prevail, and why? If the party did have functioning democracy or democratic centralism before, and then they didn't, what happened there? So that's one thing I would want to follow up with. So continuing, now I come to another matter that is deeply troubling our party and its friends. Namely, how does it happen that a party leadership that had been almost unanimously following Browder's opportunist line for 18 months could suddenly switch over and take a stand flatly against Browder? And commenting is what I was talking about with the third phase of the playlist, because a lot of people were not satisfied by this. But here's Foster's response. Continuing, in answer to this general question, I think that the basic cause of the sudden, almost spectacular change of not only the leaderships, but of party opinion, was that Browder's policy had been proved bankrupt by life itself as the war in Europe was coming to an end. Moreover, thousands of party members had accepted the policy at its outset with grave doubts and hesitations, and were ready for the change. So, in other words, a lot of people knew it was wrong, but went along with it. Now, a lot of people also just quit the party, but of those who stayed and went along with it, some of that was by choice, and some of it was because apparently there was no mechanism to actually fight it by, which no doubt led to a lot of people quitting. Anyway, continuing, there were indeed many signs of an impending change of party policy. The end of the war against Germany, the death of Roosevelt, the imperialist raid upon the San Francisco Conference of the United Nations, the obvious preparations of the NAM for a post-war drive against organized labor, the National Association of Manufacturers, the development of many strikes, etc., were awakening concern among our leaders in the National Board. Comrades Dennis, Green, Thompson, Williamson, and other leading members were either beginning to express directly opposing views to Comrade Browder's, or were raising questions that he found it increasingly difficult on the basis of his distortions of Tehran to answer. Even Browder himself, under the pressure of events, had been forced to cast aside some of the cruder forms of his revisionism, and recently had felt compelled to write several, quote, radical articles which apparently contradicted his line. Already, Dennis and Green had made proposals for a meeting of the National Committee to review our post-war perspectives and policies. Such a review could not have been avoided, and when it had eventually taken place, I'm sure it would have produced important changes in the party's line. As we can see from Comrade Browder's present opposition to the National Committee's resolution, however, such changes could have occurred only in the face of his stubborn resistance. Had the Duclos article been published a few months earlier, its reception in our party would have been much less unanimous. As things turned out, however, it appeared at just the right time. The objective situation was ripe for it, and so, increasingly, were our party leaders and members. Hence, the stage was all set for the sudden switch in party opinion that had perplexed so many people. Our party has suddenly reverted to its basic communist principles. And commenting on the end of section 1 there, it really was a violation of basic communist principles. As I said, even the sympathizers, like non-members and very beginner junior members, were going, wait a minute, I've read some Marx, and you're not doing the basic stuff. It really was that bad. And I just want to take a moment before we proceed, when we're talking about the pressures of American imperialism on the party. This atmosphere of World War II was a very intense one, as far as, everybody getting into the war effort, and there was basically government propaganda everywhere along those lines. It's not like today where they kind of just try to hide the wars more or less, or like normalize them to the point where people don't consciously focus on them or think about them. So a very different atmosphere to be sure, but being a communist means being able to stand your ground ideologically, even in the face of that kind of pressure. Continuing. Section 2. The next tasks in the struggle against revisionism. Point A. An ideological campaign against revisionism. From the party's overwhelming endorsement of the National Committee's resolution, it is clear that this convention will decisively reject Comrade Browder's bourgeois liberalism. This is vitally important, but the worst mistake we could now make would be to conclude therefrom that the fight against Browder's revisionism had been fully won, and that we can now proceed unconcernedly with our daily tasks. On the contrary, we must continue and intensify the ideological struggle. While at the conclusion of this convention, our formal general party discussion will end, and we will close our ranks and proceed in unity and discipline to the application of the line we have adopted, we must, however, conduct the broadest and deepest campaign of enlightenment we have ever led in our party. As never before, we must train our party in the fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism. I can get on board with that. To this end, we must check over the curricula, teaching personnel, and textbooks of all our schools. We must re-examine all our recent literature. We must prepare new propaganda and agitation material in harmony with our new line. We must especially be alert to eliminate not only Browder's wrong theories, but also all those opportunist ways of thinking and working that have developed during Browder's long regime as head of the party. So prevalent are these opportunist moods and methods that many comrades in state and national leading posts are deeply afflicted with them, often without even realizing the fact. The eradication of these insidious open and concealed forms of opportunism, the scars of Browderism, will need our close and earnest attention in the coming period. At the same time, we will have to be vigilantly on guard against a sharp growth of pseudo-left or ultra-left sectarianism, which is a perennial danger in our party and of which there are already manifestations. We must avoid doing what we have done several times before during sharp turns in party policy, namely, to make the mistake of overcorrection. Comment: they were not really in danger of this, so again, I think that this betrays Foster's sort of moderate rightward drift, but anyway. We must avoid flying from the one extreme of open revisionism to the other extreme of a narrow sectarianism. One evil is as harmful as the other. Point B. Re-establish the Communist Party. It is the National Board's opinion that this convention should reconstitute the Communist Party. It was a grave error to form the Communist Political Association in the first place, a long step toward dissolving the communist movement in the United States, as we now see so dramatically in the South. And it will be compounding that deadly mistake if we do not here and now reorganize the CPA into the CP. Comrade Dennis, in his report to our National Committee, showed conclusively that the formation of the CPA did not help our election campaign, as Comrade Browder avers, but seriously hampered it. Likewise, Comrade Williamson, in reporting to the National Committee, demonstrated beyond question that the continuation of CPA is having a liquidationist effect on every branch of our party work and organization. The clear lesson from all this is that the convention should re-establish the Communist Party without delay, including especially the organization in the South. There are no electoral complexities in this country that the Communist Party cannot meet better than the CPA. To keep the present name is politically indefensible. We will have more standing among the people operating frankly as the Communist Party. Besides, every advanced worker knows the meaning of a party, but does anyone, even Comrade Browder himself, really know what a political association is? Only with a party can we meet the great tasks confronting us. Failure to re-establish the Communist Party at this convention would be a major political mistake. It would disappoint our membership, it would cripple our future work, it would stimulate the Browder opposition, it would be a sign that we are not clear-sighted and resolute enough to take the decisive steps necessary to eradicate Browder's revisionism. Point C. Refresh and strengthen the party leadership. During my various reports and articles in this situation, I have taken Comrade Browder sharply to task for our party's revisionist mistake. I have done this because Browder was the chief author of the revisionism. He authorized it, he rammed it down our party's throat without discussion, he now refuses to accept correction, and he has been busily trying to organize an opposition against the National Committee's resolution. Some comrades believe, however, that I have been unduly severe in polemizing against Browder, but this is sentimentalism when it's not political uncertainty. Comrade Browder has done and is still doing severe injury to our party. He subjected it to ridicule when he introduced his absurd capitalist ideas into it a year and a half ago, and he is exposing it to a severe red-baiting attack now that we have to change back from his false policies. He has seriously weakened our party's daily work and confused its membership. He has also profoundly lowered our party's prestige among other communist parties. While it is necessary, therefore, to concentrate the main fire against Browder as the ideological leader of our revisionist error, this does not remove the heavy burden of responsibility borne by the rest of our national leadership, especially the members of the National Board. It was a great weakness that our leadership was not capable of theoretically unmasking Browder's opportunism and thus saving the party from the ensuing ravages in its work, its prestige, and its membership. Political mistakes are serious matters and cannot be lightly passed over. In these times of crucial struggle against fascism, they involve the welfare, the liberties, and possibly even the lives of large masses of people. Leaders who make such mistakes must therefore be held strictly responsible. Consequently, the proposal as stated in the National Committee's resolution to, quote, refresh and strengthen the personnel of all responsible leading committees in the association is a pertinent one. The party must provide the best guarantees it can in its leadership that such a disastrous mistake shall not take place again. This does not signify, however, as some comrades assert, that, quote, the whole national leadership must be cleaned out, unquote. Such a leftist course would be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Well, let's hear the arguments about particular individuals, but as you just said, they did allow it to happen. Continuing, communist parties are not infallible, and even the best Marxists sometimes make mistakes. Yeah, this is a pretty big one, though. The distinction between communist parties and other parties of the people in this respect is that, armed with the science of Marxism-Leninism, the former make far fewer mistakes than any other group, and when they do commit errors, they frankly admit and correct them. Just a little while ago, Stalin stated that many serious errors had been made in the USSR during the prosecution of the war, and in his famous speech on mastering Bolshevism, delivered on March 3, 1937, available here on the channel, when pointing out that the leadership of the party made the serious error of failing to recognize the danger of Trotskyism, he said, quote, how can it be explained that our leading comrades, who have a rich experience of struggle against every kind of anti-party and anti-Soviet trend, proved to be so blind and naive in this case that they were unable to recognize the real face of the enemies of the people, were unable to discern the wolves in sheep's clothing, were unable to tear the mask from them. They forgot Soviet power has conquered only 1/6 of the world, that 5/6 of the world is in possession of capitalist powers. They forgot that the Soviet Union is in conditions of capitalist encirclement, unquote. This was a very serious error, as all will agree, and in the most advanced communist party in the world. Comment, I'm not sure that these two situations actually are comparable, but I just don't think that they're really kind of like a one-to-one. They're not that similar, in my opinion, but anyway. When errors are made by communist leaders, and our error was a serious one, it calls for a check-over of the leading forces. But this must not be interpreted as a signal for a reckless decimation of the party leadership. Such a decimation would be in order only if the party should have fallen into the hands of a hard-boiled group of incurable revisionists, which is not the case in our party. Comment, now I'm confused because I mean, what he's saying is that there was just basically one main revisionist and that the rest of the party leadership who actually, I mean, in the case of Dennis and Williamson, we have shown was right there with Browder in 1944, calling for the creation of the CPA in place of the CPUSA. So maybe they weren't all committed, but they were just sort of going along with it. But is it really much better in practice, or even really much different in practice? So I thought that this was pretty good up to this point. He's kind of starting to lose my sympathy to some extent in the case that he's making now, but let's continue. What is called for in our situation in order to refresh and strengthen the leadership, therefore, is to select our new national committee, a national board, on the basis of a careful review of the various members' qualifications, including their social background, their Marxist-Leninist training, their previous party record, their degree of participation in the present era, their connections with trade unions and mass organizations, their present attitude toward Browder's revisionism, and their general prospects of doing effective future party work. Obviously, there must be important changes in our leading committees, particularly the National Board. Trade unionists and war veterans especially must be brought into the leadership, both nationally and in the districts. The present party situation must result in a very substantial improvement in our whole party leadership. Point D. Re-establish democratic centralism. A basic essential in our fight against Browder's revisionism is to reintroduce Leninist democratic centralism into the party. During the tenure of Comrade Browder's leadership, the party drifted far from these principles and allowed itself to become infected with a corroding bureaucratism in which Browder was the key figure and chief moving force. Centralism we had, a super-centralism in fact, but very little democracy. Comrade Browder during the course of the years had managed, with the acquiescence of the leadership and of the party in general, to develop among us a totally wrong conception of communist leadership. He had grown almost into a dictator. His authority reached such a point that his word became virtually unchallengeable in our party. His policies and writings finally were accepted almost uncritically by the leaders and the general membership. Browder created around himself an atmosphere of infallibility and unchallengeable authority. All this was accentuated by the deluge of petty bourgeois adulation, praise-mongering, and hero worship that was constantly poured upon him by our leadership and our members. Comrade Browder was deeply intoxicated by this unseemly adulation and by his arbitrary power. He quite lost his political balance from it. He abandoned communist modesty and Leninist self-criticism and fell into the most extravagant boasting. This boasting attitude has done Browder great personal damage, and it has brought havoc to our party. Constantly grasping for more power, Comrade Browder had largely liquidated the political functions of the party's leading bodies. He habitually bypassed the national board in policymaking. Characteristically, his notorious report on Tehran was never presented as a whole to the national board. All the board saw of it beforehand were a few fragments. It was sprung suddenly and sensationally, in the true Browder manner, at a national committee meeting, attended by several hundred people. The National Committee also had gradually lost all real political power. It assembled, it listened to Browder's proposals, it affirmed them, and it dispersed to the districts to impress the policy upon the membership. Of genuine political discussion there was none whatever in the National Committee. Similarly, our recent national conventions were hardly better than the National Committee meetings, with their formal endorsement of Browder's reports, no political discussions, and no self-critical examination of the leadership. So commenting, I just have to say, this is a lot more critical of Browder than I was expecting, and I wonder if the difference is that they had basically decided, to oust him, to reconstitute the party, etc., and so this had been building underneath the surface. But I think it goes to show how harmful whatever the atmosphere was previously that had been allowed to develop and that certain people were pushing for. This seems to me like more than just an effort to save face for the grave mistakes that the party allowed itself to be lulled into making. I could be wrong about that, but it seems to me like this is pretty genuine and fiery criticism, so it didn't come out of nowhere. Just a guess, though. Continuing, in this stifling bureaucratic atmosphere, Leninist collective leadership could not and did not exist. Political thinking itself was hamstrung. Comrade Browder, basing himself upon the high prestige which he enjoyed among the party membership, made policy pretty much as he saw fit, with the sad results that we now see. How far Browder was prepared to go to prevent political discussion was shown by the way he suppressed my letter of January 1944 to the National Committee. The only way I could have gotten this letter to the membership was by facing expulsion and a sure split in the party. Even then, my letter would not have really come before the party, for the issue would have been the unity of the party, and anyone who attempted to discuss my letter would have been denounced as a Trotskyite by Browder. The party must insist that this whole bureaucratic system be swept away, in the districts and nationally, as a basic condition for freeing itself from Browder's revisionism. There must be a genuine collective leadership built up. So commenting, this is kind of what I was saying before. It sounded like he wasn't going hard enough on some of the other board members, but now he is calling, at least for the Browderist machine to sort of be torn up. So does he target all the correct areas or not? Not sure, but this is further reaching than the earlier section would have indicated. Continuing, the Secretariat must report regularly to the National Board, which must discuss its reports freely. The National Committee must establish its political power, and it must have the fullest freedom to discuss all reports coming from the National Board or members of the Secretariat. Important differences of opinion in the National Board must be reported to the National Committee. The National Convention must not be a mere rubber stamp, as it was under Browder's leadership, but must be, in fact as well as in name, the most authoritative body in our party. The party must insist that the party leaders be self-critical, and it must learn to be on guard against leaders who cover up their mistakes instead of frankly admitting and analyzing them. Petty bourgeois adulation of leaders must also be ended. We should respect our chosen leaders, but not make gods of them. We must insist that real political discussion take place at all levels of the party, from the branches to the highest committees. However, our party is not a debating society. We have to arrive at decisions and then resolutely carry them out. But we can neither formulate sound policies nor carry them out effectively without collective thinking, collective discussion, and collective leadership. Only by applying the sound principles of Leninist democratic centralism can our party keep its mistakes to a minimum and develop the clear-thinking unity of action and resolute discipline that are the great strength of communist parties all over the world. Point E. Strengthen the party's independent role. Central to Comrade Browder's revisionism was the constant playing down of the independent role of the Communist Party. This blunting of the political initiative of our party expressed itself in various forms of tailing after the bourgeoisie. This deadly opportunism is to be found in Browder's leadership for at least the past 10 years. It has had the effect of facilitating the demagogy of the Trotskyites and Dubinsky Social Democrats. Thus, under Browder's leadership, our party habitually failed to criticize adequately the Roosevelt administration for its shortcomings and to come forward boldly with its own proposals. Boy, is this reminding me of CPUSA today. In the same spirit of tailism, Browder refused to criticize sharply the reactionary policies of the AFL Executive Council, except in the most flagrant cases. But the worst instance of all was his attempt to set our party to tail-ending shamelessly after American finance capital directly, by picturing the National Association of Manufacturers, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the American Bankers Association, and other reactionary employers' associations as progressive bodies and as qualified therefore to lead the nation in various branches of its economic and political policy. This example of tailism, which is the very core of the distortion of the Tehran decisions, was the most disgraceful piece of misleadership in the history of our party. Another expression of Comrade Browder's settled policy of minimizing our party's leading role was his systematic hiding of our light under a bushel. That is, instead of having our party speaking out boldly under its own name on all political questions, Browder nearly always, in recent years, sought to shove the party into the background and to surrender the initiative to other organizations. This harmful practice has done much to weaken our prestige among the masses, to surround our party with a false conspiratorial air, and to hamper the full legalization of our movement. Still another, and a very deadly form of such playing down of the role of the party, was Browder's long-continued practice of virtually limiting our party's activities to mass agitation and of avoiding all mass organization and struggle. Browder has a magic reverence for the spoken word. He is a talker, not a mass fighter. He has had very little experience in, or understanding of, the need to back up the word with action. Especially of recent years has this trend become manifest as Browder, poisoned by our sickly adulation, developed more and more of an inflated idea of the importance of his speeches. He eventually got to the point where he seemed to believe that all that was necessary in the case of a given issue was for him to make a speech, for the party to scatter huge quantities of it throughout the country, and all would be well. Browder grossly underestimates the importance of mass organization and political struggle, so that it is several years since our party has organized any real mass movements on its own, or by mobilizing its forces to support other organizations that were campaigning for the people's rights. This long-developing tendency of liquidating the mass organization work of the party finally reached its climax in the dissolution of the party and the formation of the CPA as almost exclusively a political educational society. The party must break sharply with Browder's chronic tailism, his hiding the party's face, and his avoidance of mass struggle. The party must recover its political initiative and communist boldness, even though certain public officials, leaders of the AFL Executive Council and of the National Association of Manufacturers, may not like it. It is good, of course, that many mass organizations now speak out progressively on various questions, and we must do all we can to develop this trend. But this must not be done by pushing the Communist Party into the background, into the shadows, where the workers cannot see it in action. Our party, if it is to be reorganized by the masses as their political leader, must speak out quickly and boldly on every important question. Of course, in this sharpening up of the party's political role, we must not fall into the sectarian errors of the past. And above all, our party must regain its skill of backing up its spoken word with the most complete possible mobilization of our membership and of the organizations with which we cooperate. At the present time, we are facing a big task in this respect in the wage movements of the workers, where there's the most urgent need of our helping to organize a broad and active political campaign within the framework of the wartime no-strike pledge. We will face a still greater task in the congressional elections of 1946, when the reactionaries will make a desperate attempt to capture control of Congress. We must employ all our skill to awaken and mobilize the workers and all democratic forces to beat back the political offensive of reaction. So comment there, that's the end of point E. What is he talking about here? First of all, it's correct that there was a big reactionary push at this time, which is how the Taft-Hartley Anti-Labor Act, which basically killed the labor movement, was not only passed by Congress, but they were able to override the presidential veto of it by Truman. And they did that with the involvement of at least part of the Democratic Party. But if people have resources on what the CPUSA actually did during those elections, I'd be interested in seeing that. Continuing, point F, improve the party's social composition. To eliminate Browder's opportunism, and to build a strong dike against its future recurrence, the party must radically improve the social composition of its membership and of its leadership. We must enlist more and more workers from the basic industries. We must above all recruit trade unionists and war veterans and bring them into our leadership. The winning of such members will be facilitated by the party's present change of line. The morale of our party members and sympathizers is now being greatly raised by the party's new line. They are happy to get from underneath the suffocating cloud of Browder's opportunism and bourgeois revisionism. We should be alert, therefore, to translate this new enthusiasm into a big party-building campaign that will bring many thousands of new members into our party, particularly in our concentration districts, and that will vastly extend the circulation of the Daily Worker and the rest of our press. The best answer we can make to Comrade Browder and his revisionism will be to enroll many thousands of new members into our party. Workers from the steel mills, coal miners, automobile plants, railroads, and other key and basic industries. So the next section is labeled Section 4, Some Questions Answered, although careful listeners will note that the last section was Section 2. I assume this is just an error, but Section 4, Some Questions Answered. The supreme measure of our new policy is its application in practice to the immediate demands and interests of the people. Only if we have successful practical mass policies and activities can we free ourselves from Browder's revisionism on the one hand and avoid the pitfalls of pseudo-left sectarianism on the other. I want to direct my concluding remarks to the correction of some general misconceptions regarding the new political line of our party. The first of these misconceptions is voiced in the argument that Comrade Browder stands for a broad national unity, whereas the new line of the party tends to narrow down our activities. The reverse is the case. Actually, Comrade Browder's policy, measured in the light of our party's experience, was definitely cutting down our organization and its mass contacts. Proof of this is the fact that his liquidatory policy was fast taking the vitality out of our party and throwing it into a serious internal crisis. Thus, it was undermining the very foundations of all our work. Besides, Browder's line, with its nonsense about the so-called progressive capitalists voluntarily protecting the workers' interests, was destroying our party's prestige among the workers and alienating them from us, as was shown in the defeat of the communists in more than one important trade union election in this period. Many of our party members found Browder's policy so absurd that they would not even try to apply it in the industries. But a comrade, Frida Werb of Buffalo, in a discussion article showed what happened to comrades who did try to apply the policies in the shops. Quote, "Being faced with layoffs as we were, the discussion in the plant naturally was around what was going to happen to us after we were laid off, and what sort of post-war world we were going to live in. For months I stood there and told everyone who would listen that in the post-war world our purchasing power would be greatly increased. The capitalists would voluntarily pay us more money because they wanted to have a prosperous post-war world. I may say in passing that many either wouldn't listen, or having listened, laughed." Unquote. If we had persisted in advancing Browder's no-strike pledge for the post-war period, it would have isolated us in the labor movement. In addition to all this, Browder succeeded in alienating whole sections of pro-war liberal forces of the country and turning them into a vitriolic opposition to our party. There is nothing broad in a policy that cuts the heart out of our party, ruins our prestige among the workers, and violently antagonizes the democratic forces generally. In contrast to all this, the new party line will build the party and inspire its members with an incomparably better morale. It will restore our waning standing among the workers. It will lay the basis for real cooperation with all democratic forces. It will lay the basis for the broadest possible democratic coalition. The second misconception that I want to deal with is now being spread by Browder. It is akin to the foregoing one, and it runs to the effect that Comrade Browder speaks for the whole nation, whereas the party, with its new line, speaks only for the working class. So let me just comment there. That is the nature of a political party. It represents a class. Lenin talks about this extensively. That is pretty basic. So what does Foster say? Continuing, "This too is a falsification of realities. Browder is speaking for a nation which he wants to be led by reactionary finance capital. In doing this, he is speaking in the interest not of the nation, but of the big capitalists. Whereas our party is speaking for a nation in which only the proletariat can and must be the decisively progressive force. It thereby indeed speaks for the whole nation. Thus, in the present fight to maintain their wage rates, our party holds that the workers are in fact fighting to advance the economic prosperity of the nation by preventing the collapse of their purchasing power and with it a breakdown of the whole industrial machine." Yeah, this is not so good. "We maintain that in all their wage struggles, therefore, the workers should place in the very forefront of their propaganda the fact that by keeping up their wages, they are defending most vital economic interests of the entire people. The same principle holds true of the other fields of struggle of the working class. By championing the interests of the proletariat in this broad sense, the party is indeed speaking in the true interest of the whole nation. The same is true regarding the fight of the party in behalf of the Negro people, the farmers, and the middle classes." So, commenting, I really think that that was not well said at all, even partially incorrect, so poorly stated as to appear incorrect at least, because we're still kind of on the national unity topic here, which is basically like a fascist concept. And so when Browder says that his version of the party speaks for the whole nation, but the new line speaks only for the working class, yeah, I mean, that's kind of the idea. And then Foster kind of jumps in with no, we don't just speak for the working class. I mean, he clarifies somewhat by saying that the proletariat can and must be the decisively progressive force. It thereby indeed speaks for the whole nation, but it really doesn't. I mean, the Communist Party does fight some elements within the existing nation, namely the bourgeoisie and its supporters. And there's really nothing wrong with that class against class outlook, and shying away from that repeatedly during this time period, I think was a major mistake. And yeah, there's something to be said for in the USSR, they did the alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry with the proletariat in the lead. And yeah, this does represent the overwhelming numerical majority of the country, but it really isn't the whole nation. And, I think it just confuses people to say that. This other point about preventing the collapse or the breakdown of the whole industrial machine, you're kind of getting into the territory of managing capitalism at that point. And I don't know, I think shaky ground, not a really good answer in my opinion. But continuing, a third erroneous idea now being circulated in the party by Browder would have the party membership believe that whereas Comrade Browder is the champion of Tehran, the party is now opposed to the Tehran decisions. Nothing could be further from the truth. And I just have to comment here, I know that Browder was obsessed with Tehran, but did anyone actually care about this beyond this little drama? I don't really understand. I've never really heard reference to this in any other context. You hear about Yalta sometimes, but not Tehran. And I don't know, it just was the average American person I'd support the communists, but Tehran. Continuing, In reality, Browder, by appeasing American finance capital, is surrendering to the worst enemies of Tehran, whereas our party, by basing its present policy upon the combined struggle of the democratic forces of the world, is taking the only course by which the great objectives laid down at Tehran can be achieved. Complete victory over fascism can be won in this war. Peace can be maintained for a long period of time, and joint steps can be undertaken by the United Nations for world economic rehabilitation. However, the way to these ends is not, as Browder proposes, to turn world leadership over to American finance capital, but through alert struggle by the democratic elements throughout the world against monopoly, especially the most reactionary sections of American finance capital. So commenting, we read in some of the earlier, more tepidly critical pieces that, Browder was wrong about monopoly capital, that it was reactionary, and this was kind of one of the main points that Foster and others felt comfortable criticizing him on at that point. And they should, because that is absurd. It's so far over the line, it's not debatable, and it should be actually immediate grounds for expulsion from a party if you're arguing something like that. I still think that the correction that Foster is setting up here is really shaky ground, and I think, again, poorly stated, with emphasis in the wrong places, and even some theoretical problems. Continuing, the fourth and last false conception that I wish to speak against is the idea being circulated by ultra-left or pseudo-left sectarian voices in our party to the effect that the present program of the party is only transitory, that we are on our way to a much more left interpretation of the present national and world situation. According to these comrades, we are going to, or should, denounce the war against Japan as imperialist, condemn the decisions of Tehran as unachievable, drop the slogan of national unity, call for a farmer-labor government, give up our wartime no-strike pledge, abandon the fight for 60 million jobs, bring forward the question of socialism as an immediate issue, and generally adopt a class-against-class policy. Comment. Wow, that was quite the slew of topics. I think about half of those made sense, half of them don't. But as Foster is not citing anyone who was making these claims, we can't really go back unless people know of particular references and evaluate the cases for each of those points. That could be interesting, so let me know if you know of them. Continuing, but these comrades are indulging in wishful thinking. Our party, if I know it, is not going to take any such leftist course. For the party, in its overwhelming majority, understands that leftist policies of this character would be no less disastrous to us than Browder's right revisionism. The line of the National Committee's resolution is the correct one. In its analysis, its formulation of immediate demands, and its placing of the question of socialism, we must hew to the line of that resolution, taking into account, of course, necessary amendments. We are not getting rid of Browder's right opportunism to fall into a swamp of ultra-left or pseudo-left sectarianism. So commenting again, I think that I really would like to hear the case for some of those things, and those would be interesting debates and discussions. I think that the CPUSA at this point was barely able to get a handle on Browder's overt liberalism, and I wouldn't necessarily trust that a party that weak was able to correctly assess all of those other questions. So again, if people know of more materials on those particular debates, maybe we can get into that. Continuing. Now, in conclusion, let me say that our party at the present time is passing through one of the most serious crises in all its history. There are those who hope that it will lose heavily in membership and will fall into a bitter and destructive factionalism. But such people, whether inside or outside of the party, will be completely disappointed. The party is making this crucial turn in decisive unity. There will be no factionalism, nor will our party tolerate any either from the right or from the ultra-left. Our party will emerge from this situation healthy and growing, with its mass contacts broadened and strengthened, and with its members and leaders refreshed and fortified by a deeper understanding of the great science of Marxism-Leninism. With the economic conditions of the workers deteriorating and unemployment growing, with the National Association of Manufacturers, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and other employers' organizations out to weaken or smash the unions, with the combined reactionaries planning an all-out attempt to capture Congress in 1946, and with the government lacking an adequate response to the workers' needs, obviously serious economic and political struggles loom in this country. The workers will have to defend actively their rights, economic standards, and unions. The people in general will have to fight for the objectives of Tehran, Yalta, and San Francisco. This situation will place great responsibilities upon us communists. but with our party rejuvenated and reinvigorated, and playing the vanguard role, we will face these oncoming struggles with communist confidence and resoluteness. And that's the end of the audiobook. So I've made most of my comments, but I guess on this closing note, might have been a little overconfident. But in the coming installments of this playlist, we will continue with others in the official anti-Browderist reconstitution of the CPUSA. The next video is actually the Reconstitution of the Communist Party by John Williamson, which was a speech delivered at the same conference that one was delivered at. So clearly this reconstitution and the overthrow of Browder was marketed as a major victory. However, from another, possibly more obvious angle, the entire Browder affair was such a deep embarrassment, such a fundamental failure of a group of communists supposedly adhering to Marxist-Leninist principles, that it's something like someone claiming to be the world's foremost gun safety expert, who actually has blown off half their toes and one leg below the knee, holding a victory conference to announce that they haven't shot off any new body parts in over a year. Yeah, you're not supposed to do that. And honestly, we might prefer to listen to someone else on this topic from now on. In other words, is this too little too late? Is the damage already done? Could the CPUSA regain its standing? Well, these questions remain as we proceed on with our playlist, and you can find the next video coming soon to a streaming service near you. So, that's it for me. What do you think? Leave a question or comment in the comment section below, and we'll continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. Again, patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. If you like this channel, you find these videos helpful, educational, interesting, useful, please do leave a contribution because we don't run ads. It's a non-commercial channel, and we just rely on viewer support. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's just thanks, good video, or random letters. Finally, you can agitate and educate online, but organizing takes place in real life, so do get connected with your local left, find out what's going on and how you can get involved. Thanks again, and we will see you in the next video.